It was a chilly autumn afternoon, the kind where the air feels crisp and fresh and golden leaves swirl around campus pathways. Karoline Leavitt pulled her scarf tighter as she walked toward her philosophy class. She wasn't just another face. In the crowd, she was someone who carried her faith close to her heart. For her, Christianity wasn't just a set of beliefs. It was a source of strength, comfort, and purpose. The classroom buzzed with chatter as students settled into their seats. It was a diverse group, each person bringing their own perspective to the table. Some were there for the grades, others for the intellectual challenge. But everyone seemed eager to dive into the day's topic. The professor, known for his sharp wit and no-nonsense approach, stood at the front, shuffling through his notes. He had a reputation for stirring up lively debates, often pushing students out of their comfort zones. Karoline took her usual seat near the middle of the room. She opened her notebook and clicked her pen, ready to jot down anything interesting. But little did she know this lecture would turn into something far more personal than she ever expected. As the professor began speaking, he posed a provocative question to the class. Why do people still cling to ancient myths like religion when science has already answered so many questions? His tone was casual, almost dismissive, but there was an edge to it that caught Karoline's attention. Then came the words that made her freeze mid-note-taking. He referred to Jesus Christ as nothing more than a fairy tale character. A myth. Something humans invented because they couldn't handle the uncertainty of life. The room went quiet for a moment before murmurs of agreement rippled through the class. Most students nodded along or scribbled furiously in their notebooks, treating it as just another academic point to consider. But for Karoline, it hit differently. Her chest tightened and her mind raced. This wasn't just some abstract idea being discussed. It felt deeply personal, like a direct attack on something she held sacred. Growing up, Karoline had learned about love, kindness, and sacrifice through the stories of Jesus. These teachings weren't just words to her. They were principles she lived by. To hear them reduced to a fairy tale felt not only disrespectful, but also unfair. After all, billions of people worldwide found meaning, hope, and guidance in these beliefs. How could anyone dismiss that so easily? For a few seconds, Karoline sat frozen, unsure of what to do. Should she say something? What if she embarrassed herself? What if the other students laughed at her? Her palms grew sweaty as doubt crept in. But beneath the fear, another feeling stirred, a quiet determination. This wasn't just about defending her faith. It was about standing up for something she truly believed in. And maybe, just maybe, it was about showing others that faith wasn't something to be mocked. It was something worth exploring. As the professor moved on to the next slide, Karoline hesitated for a moment longer. Then with a deep breath, she slowly raised her hand. Her heart pounded as she waited for him to notice. When he finally called on her, she felt a mix of nerves and resolve wash over her. Little did she know, this simple act of raising her hand would spark a conversation that would leave a lasting impact, not just on her, but on everyone in that room. When the professor called on her, Karoline's throat felt dry. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. The room was eerily quiet now, every eye fixed on her. It wasn't the kind of attention she usually craved. It was heavy, almost suffocating. But she reminded herself why she had raised her hand in the first place. This wasn't just about her. It was about standing up for something bigger than herself. I understand we're here to discuss different perspectives, she began, her voice soft but clear. But I think calling Jesus a fairy tale oversimplifies something that has profoundly impacted billions of lives. Her words hung in the air for a moment, and she could feel the weight of them settling over the room. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats while others leaned forward, intrigued. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Her mind raced back to all the moments when her faith had carried her through tough times. The late nights spent praying for guidance, the mornings filled with gratitude even when things seemed bleak. How could anyone dismiss that as mere fiction? She knew not everyone shared her beliefs, but reducing them to a myth felt like brushing aside centuries of history, culture, and human experience. Taking another deep breath, she continued. There's Actually historical evidence outside of religious texts that supports the existence of Jesus. Roman historians like Tacitus and Josephus mentioned him in their writings. Even if you don't believe in his divinity, you can't ignore the fact that he existed and changed the course of history. The professor raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard by her response. He hadn't expected someone to challenge him so directly, especially not in such a calm and composed manner. Karolina pressed on, her confidence growing with each word. And beyond the historical aspect, look at the impact his teachings have had on humanity. Love your neighbor, forgive others, care for the poor. These aren't outdated ideas. They're principles that still shape how people live today. As she spoke, she noticed subtle changes in the room. A few classmates nodded approvingly, while others exchanged glances, whispering quietly among themselves. One girl near the front smiled faintly, as if silently cheering her on. For the first time since raising her hand, Karoline felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she wasn't alone in feeling unsettled by the professor's earlier remarks, but the professor wasn't ready to concede. After a brief pause, he replied coolly, "Interesting points, but historical evidence doesn't necessarily prove divinity. People create stories all the time to make sense of the world." His tone was dismissive, but there was a hint of curiosity beneath it, a crack in his armor that suggested he hadn't completely shut her down. Karoline sat back down, her heart still racing. She felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her: relief that she had spoken up, pride in how she handled herself, and frustration that the conversation hadn't gone further. As the class resumed, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Something had shifted in the room and she wasn't sure what would come next. Later that evening, as she replayed the scene in her mind, Karoline realized she had done more than just defend her faith. She had opened a door, one that invited others to think critically, ask questions, and engage in meaningful dialogue. Whether or not the professor agreed with her didn't matter as much as the fact that she had planted a seed. And sometimes that's all it takes to start a change. For the rest of the day, Karoline couldn't help but wonder, what if more people spoke up when they felt strongly about something? What if conversations like this became less about winning arguments and more about understanding each other? These thoughts lingered in her mind long after the lecture ended, fueling her determination to keep pushing forward, even when it felt uncomfortable. The moment Karoline sat back down, the room felt different. It wasn't just her who had been shaken by the exchange. The entire atmosphere had shifted. Some students were whispering to each other, glancing at her now and then. Others stared, ahead lost in thought as if processing what they'd just heard. Even the professor seemed a little rattled, though he tried to mask it by flipping through his notes and moving on to the next slide. But for Karoline, the hardest part was yet to come. Sitting there, she couldn't help but replay her words in her head. Had she said enough? Could she have explained herself better? Doubts crept in like shadows, making her second-guess every sentence she had spoken. She wondered if anyone truly understood where she was coming from, or worse, if they thought she sounded foolish. As the class wrapped up, the professor dismissed everyone with a casual wave of his hand. Most students grabbed their bags and hurried out, eager to escape the tension that still lingered in the air. But not everyone left so quickly. A few stayed behind, some approaching Karoline hesitantly while others hung back, watching silently. One girl, a quiet classmate who rarely spoke, during lectures walked over and tapped her shoulder. "Hey," she said softly, almost shyly. "I just wanted to say thank you. I didn't agree with everything the professor said earlier either, but I didn't know how to say anything. You did it so well." Karoline blinked, surprised. She hadn't expected gratitude, let alone acknowledgement. "Oh, thanks," she stammered, unsure of how to respond. "I just felt like someone needed to say something." Another student chimed in, this time a guy who usually dominated discussions. "Honestly, I don't really believe in all that stuff," he admitted, gesturing vaguely toward the topic of faith. "But I respect how calm and respectful you were. That's not easy to do when people are being critical. Their words lifted a weight off Karoline's shoulders. For the first time since raising her hand, she realized she wasn't completely alone in her feelings. There were others in the room who had felt uneasy too. They just hadn't known how to express it. And somehow her decision to speak up had given them permission to feel validated. Still, not everyone reacted positively. As Karoline packed up her things and headed out of the classroom, she overheard snippets of conversations. One group of students muttered about how religious people always get so defensive, and how bringing personal beliefs into academics is pointless. Their voices carried an edge of frustration, as if her response had disrupted the flow of the class. For a moment, Karoline felt a pang of guilt. Had she gone too far? Was it wrong to challenge authority, even when it felt justified? These questions swirled in her mind as she walked across campus, the autumn wind tugging at her scarf. She replayed the criticisms in her head, wondering if she should have kept quiet after all. But then something unexpected happened. As she scrolled through social media later that evening, she noticed posts popping up from classmates recounting the day's events. Someone had written, "Today in philosophy class, one person stood up and reminded us why it's important to speak your truth, even when it's hard." Another comment read, "Faith or no faith, we need more people willing to engage respectfully instead of shutting others down." Reading those words gave Karoline a new perspective. She realized that her actions weren't just about defending her beliefs. They were about modeling how to handle disagreement with grace and courage. Sure, not everyone agreed with her, and not everyone would ever see things her way, but that wasn't the point. The real victory lay in sparking a conversation, in showing others that it was okay to stand firm in what you believed without resorting to anger or hostility. By the time she turned off her phone and climbed into bed, Karoline felt a renewed sense of purpose. Speaking up had been scary, yes, but it had also been empowering. She had faced her fears, articulated her thoughts clearly, and inspired others to reflect on their own views. And while she knew this wouldn't be the last time she encountered criticism or pushback, she also knew she could handle it. That night, as she drifted off to sleep, Karoline made a silent promise to herself. No matter how uncomfortable it got, she would continue to use her voice, not to argue or divide, but to connect and understand. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply step forward and say, "This matters to me." Part 4. The Ripple Effect. The next morning, Karoline woke up to a flurry of notifications on her phone. At first she thought it was just the usual mix of memes and group chats, but as she scrolled through her messages, she realized something bigger was happening. Friends from other classes had texted her saying they'd heard about what happened in philosophy class. Even acquaintances she barely knew were reaching out, some congratulating her, others asking questions about her perspective. Word had spread across campus faster than she could have imagined. In the cafeteria line later that day, she overheard a group of students talking about the incident. "Did you hear about that girl who stood up to Professor?" one of them said. "Yeah, apparently she gave him a piece of her mind," another replied. Karoline froze for a second, unsure if she should step in or stay quiet. But before she could decide, someone spotted her and nudged the others. "Hey, isn't that her?" Suddenly, all eyes were on her again. A few smiled warmly, while others looked curious, waiting to see how she'd react. Feeling a bit overwhelmed, Karoline gave a small wave and said, "Hi, yeah, that was me." To her relief, the group didn't bombard her with questions. Instead, one of them joked, "You're kind of famous now." They laughed lightly, breaking the tension, and invited her to sit with them. As she joined their table, the conversation naturally turned to faith, philosophy, and the role of religion in modern life. Some shared their own beliefs, while others admitted they weren't sure what they believed at all. What struck Karoline most was how open everyone seemed to be. There was no hostility, no judgment, just honest curiosity. It reminded her why she had spoken up in the first place, not to win an argument but to create space for dialogue. Later that afternoon, as she walked to her next class, she noticed posters taped to bulletin boards around campus. One caught her. It advertised a student-led discussion titled, Faith and focus. Can belief coexist with modern thought? Scrawled at the bottom in bold letters was a note. Inspired by recent events. Karoline smiled to herself, realizing her actions had sparked more than just casual conversations. They had inspired action, but not everything was positive. As the day went on, she started noticing comments online from people who disagreed with her stance. Anonymous posts popped up on forums criticizing her for being too religious or pushing her agenda in a secular environment. Some accused her of disrupting the classroom dynamic, while others dismissed her entirely, claiming her arguments lacked depth. At first, the negativity hit hard. Reading those words made her stomach churn and her confidence waver. Was she wrong to speak up? Had she caused more harm than good? Sitting alone in her dorm room, she stared at the screen, feeling the weight of the criticism pressing down on her. Then, unexpectedly, support began pouring in. A Jewish student from another department sent her a private message saying, "I don't share your beliefs, but I admire your courage to stand up for them. That takes guts." Another classmate, who identified as agnostic, commented on a post, writing, "I may not agree with everything she said, but I respect how respectfully she presented her views. We need more of that." These messages gave Karoline strength. She realized that every movement, no matter how small, attracts both praise and pushback. What mattered wasn't avoiding criticism. It was staying true to herself, despite it. Her goal hadn't been to convince everyone in the room to believe as she did. It was to show that faith and reason could coexist, that differing opinions didn't have to lead to division. By the end of the week, Karoline found herself reflecting on the whirlwind of attention she'd received. She had gone from being an ordinary student blending into the crowd to someone others looked to for insight and inspiration. It was a strange feeling, one that came with its own set of challenges. But amidst the noise, the praise, the backlash, the endless chatter, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. This experience had taught her something invaluable. Standing up for your beliefs doesn't mean shouting louder than everyone else. It means speaking with clarity, listening with empathy, and engaging with humility. And sometimes it means planting seeds that won't sprout until much later. As she sat in her dorm room late one night, journaling about the past few days, Karoline wrote down a single sentence that summed it all up. Courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you are. She closed her notebook, feeling a quiet resolve settle over her. Whatever came next, she knew she was ready to face it head-on. The buzz around campus didn't die down anytime soon. If anything, it grew louder as the days passed. Karoline became a topic of conversation in hallways, coffee shops, and even online forums. While some praised her for her courage, others were quick to criticize. The backlash wasn't subtle. It came in waves, often harsh and unfiltered. One evening, as she scrolled through social media during a rare quiet moment, Karoline stumbled upon an anonymous thread about her. The comments ranged from snarky remarks like, "Religion has no place in academics," to outright insults questioning her intelligence. One particularly biting comment read, "She probably thinks the earth is flat too." It stung, not because it was clever or original, but because it felt so dismissive, like her thoughts, her beliefs, and her voice didn't matter. For a while, she debated whether to respond. Part of her wanted to defend herself, to explain that she hadn't been trying to force her beliefs on anyone. But another part of her knew better. Engaging with trolls rarely ended well, and she didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. Still, it was hard not to take the criticism personally. Each negative comment felt like a tiny weight added to her shoulders, making it harder to shake off the doubt creeping into her mind. The negativity wasn't limited to online spaces either. In person, she encountered awkward moments too. Some classmates avoided eye contact, perhaps unsure of how to act around someone who had suddenly become the center of controversy. Others made backhanded compliments, saying things like, "I respect your passion, even if I don't agree," followed by a shrug that implied they thought she was misguided. But what hurt most was when people she considered friends seemed hesitant to stand by her. One girl she'd studied with several times casually mentioned, You know, you might have come across a little intense in class. Another friend joked, "Don't get me banned from philosophy class, okay?" Their words weren't cruel, but they carried an undertone of distance, a reminder that speaking up can sometimes cost you relationships. Despite the sting of rejection, Karoline refused to let the backlash silence her. She reminded herself why she had spoken up in the first place, not for validation but because she believed in something bigger than herself. And slowly, support began trickling in from unexpected places. A Muslim student from another department approached her after a campus event. "I saw what happened in your class," he said quietly. "It takes guts to stand up for faith in a world that tries to tear it down. Just wanted to say I admire that." His words caught her off guard, filling her with warmth and gratitude. She hadn't expected solidarity from someone whose beliefs differed from hers, yet here it was, a shared understanding that transcended religious lines. Even professors outside her philosophy class reached out. One of them, a history teacher, emailed her a list of resources about historical figures who balanced faith and reason. "Thought you might find these interesting," he wrote. "Keep asking questions. They're the foundation of learning." These small acts of kindness reminded Karoline that not everyone viewed her actions negatively. Many appreciated her willingness to engage in difficult conversations, even if they didn't agree with her perspective. It gave her the strength to push forward despite the challenges. To cope with the stress, she turned to her usual outlets: prayer, journaling, and long walks around campus. During one such walk, she found herself reflecting on the nature of criticism. Why did people react so strongly? Was it fear of being wrong? Or discomfort with opposing views? Whatever the reason, she realized that facing backlash was part of the process. Growth rarely came without friction, and standing up for her beliefs meant accepting that not everyone would cheer her on. By the end of the week, Karoline decided to address the backlash directly, but not in the way her critics expected. Instead of lashing out or retreating into silence, she posted a short message on social media. "Hi everyone," she wrote. "I know my recent comments in class have sparked a lot of discussion, both positive and negative. I just want to say thank you for engaging, for challenging me, and for reminding me that we all see the world differently. My goal wasn't to convince anyone, it was to start a conversation. Let's keep talking respectfully because that's how we grow." The post received hundreds of likes and dozens of replies, many expressing admiration for her grace under pressure. Even some of her harshest critics softened their tone, acknowledging her effort to remain open-minded. For Karoline, it was proof that compassion could disarm hostility, and that staying true to yourself didn't mean shutting others out. As she closed her laptop that night, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Yes, the backlash had been tough, but it had also shown her the power of resilience. Every challenge she faced only strengthened her resolve to keep speaking up, not just for herself, but for anyone who felt silenced or misunderstood. And deep down, she knew this experience was shaping her into someone stronger, wiser, and more empathetic than ever before. A week had passed since the heated exchange in philosophy class, and Karoline was beginning to think things were settling down. The initial wave of attention, both positive and negative, had started to ebb, and life on campus felt almost normal again. But just as she thought the dust had settled, something unexpected happened that would change everything. The professor who had dismissed Jesus as a fairy tale made an announcement at the start of their next class. He stood at the front of the room, his usual confident demeanor tinged with what looked like hesitation. Clearing his throat, he said, "Given recent discussions, I've decided to host a special session titled Faith versus Reason. Can they coexist? It's open to all students, and I'd like to invite anyone interested in continuing this dialogue to attend." The room buzzed with murmurs. Some students exchanged excited glances, while others groaned under their breath, clearly uninterested. Karoline froze for a moment, unsure of how to feel. Was this his way of addressing the controversy her comments had sparked? Or was it just another academic exercise to stir debate? Whatever the reason, one thing was clear: he wasn't brushing it aside anymore. As the professor wrapped up the announcement, he added casually, "And Karoline, I hope you'll join us. Your perspective would be valuable. Her stomach dropped. She hadn't expected this, a direct invitation from him of all people. For a second, panic bubbled up inside her. What if she stumbled over her words? What if the audience turned hostile? But then she reminded herself why she had spoken up in the first place. Not to prove a point, but to foster understanding. If she skipped this opportunity, wouldn't she be letting fear win? That evening, Karoline sat at her desk surrounded by books, notes, and printed articles. This time, she wanted to come prepared. She didn't want to rely solely on emotion or personal conviction. She wanted to ground her arguments in facts and logic. She revisited historical texts, scientific discoveries influenced by faith, and philosophical writings that explored the intersection of belief and reason. She even reached out to a few professors outside her department for advice, including the history teacher who had sent her resources earlier. Remember, he told her, it's not about winning debates, it's about showing people they don't have to choose sides. On the day of the session, the lecture hall was packed. Students filled every seat, some clutching notebooks, others chatting animatedly. A few faculty members sat along the back wall watching quietly. Karoline arrived early, her heart pounding as she took a seat near the front. When the professor introduced her during the discussion, inviting her to share her thoughts, she felt a mix of nerves and determination wash over her. Standing behind the podium, she took a deep breath and began. When we talk about faith and reason, we often treat them as opposites, as if believing in one means rejecting the other. But history shows us they can coexist. Think about Isaac Newton, one of the greatest scientists of all time. He saw no conflict between his faith and his pursuit of knowledge. In fact, he believed studying the universe was a way of understanding God's design. She paused, scanning the room. Some students nodded thoughtfully while others scribbled notes. Encouraged, she continued. Even Albert Einstein, who many assume rejected religion, once said, "Science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind." Faith and reason aren't enemies. They're two sides of the same coin, each offering insights the other might miss. Her voice grew steadier as she spoke, weaving together examples from history, science, and philosophy. She talked about how faith inspired social justice movements, from abolitionists fighting slavery to civil rights leaders advocating for equality. She explained how reason helped refine religious teachings, encouraging believers to question traditions and focus on core values like compassion and humility. By the time she finished, the room erupted into applause. Not everyone agreed with her. She could see skepticism written on a few faces, but there was respect in the air. Even the professor, usually so composed, offered her a rare smile and a nod before moving on to the next speaker. Afterward, several students approached her, eager to continue the conversation. One guy admitted, "I came here thinking faith and science couldn't mix, but you gave me a lot to think about." Another girl thanked her for presenting her views so clearly, saying, "You made me realize it's okay to ask questions instead of picking sides." Walking out of the lecture hall that night, Karoline felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about planting seeds of curiosity and understanding. Whether or not people changed their minds didn't matter as much as knowing she had contributed to a meaningful dialogue. As she headed home, she reflected on how far she'd come since that first nerve-wracking moment in philosophy class. Back then, she had been unsure of herself, afraid of judgment. Now she stood tall, confident in her ability to engage respectfully with opposing viewpoints. And though the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, she knew she had found her voice, and that was something no amount of criticism could ever take away. In the months that followed, Karoline's life changed in ways she hadn't expected. What had started as a single moment of courage in a philosophy class grew into something much bigger, a ripple effect that touched not only her, but also those around her. She became known on campus as someone who wasn't afraid to speak her mind, someone who could handle tough conversations with grace and respect. It wasn't always easy, but it was rewarding in ways she couldn't have imagined. One of the first things Karoline noticed was how people began approaching her differently. Strangers would stop her in hallways or message her online, sharing their own stories of struggle and faith. Some were students questioning their beliefs for the first time. Others were searching for meaning in a world that often felt chaotic and divided. No matter where they were coming from, they all had one thing in common. They saw Karoline as someone who understood what it meant to wrestle with doubt and still hold on to hope. Inspired by these interactions, Karoline decided to take action. She founded a student group called Open Dialogue, a safe space where people could discuss controversial topics without fear of judgment. The goal wasn't to convince anyone of anything. It was simply to listen, learn, and grow together. At their first meeting, a handful of curious students showed up, unsure of what to expect. By the end of the semester, the group had grown so large they had to reserve a bigger room. The discussions ranged widely, from politics and ethics to science and spirituality, but the underlying theme was always the same: finding common ground. Karoline encouraged everyone to share their perspectives openly, reminding them that disagreement didn't have to mean division. Over time, the group became a tight-knit community, united not by shared beliefs, but by a shared commitment to understanding each other better. For Karoline, leading Open Dialogue taught her more than she ever thought possible. She learned how to navigate disagreements without taking things personally, how to ask thoughtful questions instead of jumping to conclusions, and most importantly, how to find value in opposing viewpoints. These skills stayed with her long after graduation, shaping the way she approached relationships, work, and even everyday conversations. Looking back years later, Karoline realized that standing up to her professor had been about more than defending her faith. It had been a turning point in her journey toward becoming the person she was meant to be. That one act of bravery had unlocked parts of herself she didn't know existed. It had pushed her out of her comfort zone, forced her to confront her fears, and ultimately given her the confidence to face challenges head-on. But perhaps the greatest lesson she took away was the importance of staying true to yourself while remaining open to others. Faith and reason, belief and skepticism, they weren't enemies as she'd once thought. They were tools, each offering a unique lens through which to view the world. And sometimes the hardest part wasn't choosing between them. It was learning to balance both. Years after leaving college, Karoline found herself mentoring young adults navigating similar struggles. She told them about her experience in that philosophy class, not because it made her special, but because it reminded her of an important truth. Everyone has moments when they feel small and insignificant, like their voice doesn't matter. But every voice does matter, even if it only reaches one person, sparks one idea, or plants one seed of change. Her story spread beyond campus walls, inspiring others to stand up for what they believed in, no matter how daunting it seemed. People wrote to her saying things like, "Your courage gave me the push I needed to speak up too," or, "I never thought faith and reason could go hand in hand until I heard you explain it." These messages filled her with gratitude, knowing she had played a small part in helping others find their footing. Today, Karoline continues to advocate for meaningful conversations, whether through public speaking, writing, or simply sitting down with someone over coffee. She believes deeply that the world doesn't need fewer differences. It needs more bridges. And building those bridges starts with listening, respecting, and daring to engage, even when it feels uncomfortable. Reflecting on her journey, Karoline knows she isn't perfect. She still has moments of doubt, times when fear creeps in and makes her question whether she's doing enough. But she also knows this: courage isn't about being fearless. It's about moving forward despite the fear. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is raise your hand, speak your truth, and trust that your voice will make a difference, even if you don't see it right away. As she closes another chapter of her life, Karoline smiles, knowing that the impact of that day in philosophy class will live on, not just in her story, but in the countless lives she's touched along the way. Years after the incident in that philosophy class, Karoline found herself sitting in a cozy cafe on a rainy afternoon, sipping hot tea and reflecting on how far she had come. Life had taken her down paths she never could have predicted back. Then but one thing remained constant: the lessons she had learned about courage, resilience, and connection. Those moments of standing up for what she believed in hadn't just shaped her college years. They had become the foundation for everything she did now. By this point, Karoline wasn't just known as the girl who stood up to her professor. She was someone people turned to when they needed guidance, whether it was navigating tough conversations, finding balance between faith and reason, or simply figuring out how to stay true to themselves in a world full of noise. Her journey had transformed her into a bridge builder, someone who thrived on bringing people together instead of driving them apart. One of the most surprising turns in her life came when she started receiving invitations to speak at events, conferences, workshops, even community gatherings. At first, she hesitated. Public speaking wasn't something she'd ever seen herself doing. But as more requests poured in, she realized these were opportunities to share her story with a wider audience. Each time she stepped onto a stage, she reminded herself why she was there. Not to impress anyone, but to inspire others to find their own voice. Her talks weren't flashy or overly rehearsed. Instead, they were raw and honest, filled with personal anecdotes and reflections. She often began by recounting that day in philosophy class, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was relatable. Everyone, at some point, faces a moment where they must decide whether to stay silent or speak up. By sharing her experience, she hoped to show others that their voices mattered too, even if they felt small or uncertain. What made her message resonate so deeply was its simplicity. She didn't claim to have all the answers. In fact, she openly admitted she still grappled with questions herself. But she emphasized the importance of leaning into discomfort, of embracing curiosity over certainty. Growth happens, she would say, when we step outside our comfort zones and engage with ideas that challenge us. Over time, her influence extended beyond public speaking. She wrote articles, started a podcast, and collaborated with organizations focused on fostering dialogue across divides. Her work revolved around creating spaces where people felt safe to express themselves without fear of judgment. Whether it was moderating panel discussions or hosting intimate roundtable conversations, she approached every interaction with genuine care and empathy. But perhaps the most fulfilling part of her journey was seeing the impact she had on individuals. After one event, a young woman approached her, tears streaming down her face. "I've been struggling to figure out how to stand up for my beliefs without alienating everyone around me," she confessed. "Hearing your story gave me hope that I can do both. I can be strong in what I believe while still respecting others." Another time, an older man stopped her after a talk to thank her for reminding him of the value of listening. "I've spent so much of my life trying to prove I'm right," he said. "Your words made me realize I've missed out on so many meaningful connections because I wasn't willing to hear other perspectives." These encounters stayed with Karoline long after the events ended. They reminded her that change doesn't always happen in grand gestures. It often comes through quiet, steady acts of kindness and understanding. Every person she connected with carried a piece of her story forward, spreading ripples of positivity in ways she might never fully know. As her career evolved, Karoline also faced new challenges. There were critics who dismissed her efforts as naive or idealistic, accusing her of oversimplifying complex issues. Some argued that building bridges was pointless in a polarized world, while others claimed she was trying to please everyone at the expense of taking a firm stand. These criticisms tested her resolve, forcing her to dig deeper and reaffirm her purpose. Through it all, she held on to one truth. Progress isn't about perfection, it's about persistence. Even when the road felt rocky, she kept moving forward, trusting that every step mattered. And slowly she saw evidence of that persistence paying off. Conversations that once seemed impossible began happening. Relationships once strained by differences started healing. People who had felt silenced or misunderstood found their voices again. Looking back, Karoline knew her journey wasn't unique. Countless others had walked similar paths, facing their own fears and doubts along the way. What set her apart wasn't the size of her platform or the scale of her achievements. It was her unwavering belief in the power of human connection. She genuinely believed that no matter how divided the world seemed, there was always room for understanding, compassion, and growth. On that rainy afternoon in the cafe, as she scribbled notes for her next project, Karoline smiled to herself. She thought about the shy college student she used to be, the one who had trembled with fear before raising her hand in class. That version of herself would hardly recognize the confident, resilient woman she had become. Yet deep down, she knew she was still the same person, someone who cared deeply about making a difference, one conversation at a time. And as she closed her notebook and prepared to leave, she whispered a quiet promise to herself. Keep going, keep listening, keep believing. Because in a world that often felt chaotic and divided, those simple acts could spark the kind of change that truly mattered. As the years rolled by, Karoline's story began to take on a life of its own. It wasn't just her speaking engagements or writings that kept it alive. It was the way people carried her message forward, passing it along like a torch in the dark. Her journey had become more than a personal triumph. It had grown into something bigger, something that inspired others to step into their own light. One day, while scrolling through social media, Karoline stumbled upon a post from someone she didn't recognize. The caption read, "This woman changed my life without even knowing me." Attached was a photo of a notebook filled with handwritten notes, pages and pages detailing how the person had found strength to speak up after hearing Karoline's story online. They wrote about facing discrimination at work, struggling to reconcile their faith with modern challenges, and finally finding the courage to advocate for themselves and others. Karoline stared at the screen, her eyes misting over. She had always hoped her actions would make a difference, but moments like this reminded her of just how far-reaching that impact could be. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about planting seeds of hope and watching them bloom in unexpected places. Her influence extended beyond individuals, too. Schools and community groups began reaching out, asking if she'd partner with them to create programs focused on fostering respectful dialogue. One high school invited her to lead workshops for students learning how to navigate disagreements constructively. Another organization asked her to help design a curriculum aimed at teaching empathy and critical thinking skills. These projects allowed her to reach younger generations, equipping them with tools they could use to build bridges instead of walls. But perhaps the most profound example of her legacy came when a college professor contacted her. He explained that he had once been skeptical of blending faith and reason in academic settings until he heard about her philosophy class debate years earlier. Inspired by her approach, he decided to incorporate similar discussions into his own courses, encouraging students to explore diverse perspectives openly and respectfully. "You reminded me why education is about more than facts," he wrote in an email. "It's about shaping hearts and minds." Despite all these successes, Karoline remained grounded. She knew better than anyone that life wasn't a straight path. It was messy, unpredictable, and full of ups and downs. There were still days when self-doubt crept in, whispering cruel reminders of past failures or fears of future ones. On those days, she leaned on the lessons she had learned along the way. Resilience isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up every time you do. She also surrounded herself with people who believed in her, a close-knit circle of friends, mentors, and supporters who cheered her on during tough times and celebrated her victories alongside her. Together, they formed a network of encouragement, reminding her that no one achieves greatness alone. Every success she experienced was, in some way, a shared victory. One of her proudest accomplishments came when she published a book titled Courage Beyond Comfort. In it, she shared stories from her own life as well as insights from others who had overcome fear to make a difference. The title itself reflected what she had come to see as the essence of growth. Real change happens when we push past our comfort zones and embrace vulnerability. The book resonated deeply with readers, becoming a go-to resource for anyone looking to find their voice and live authentically. Through all of this, Karoline never lost sight of her roots. She returned to her alma mater often, giving talks and mentoring students who reminded her so much of her younger self. During one visit, a freshman approached her nervously and said, "I'm scared to stand up for what I believe in because I don't want to be judged. What if I mess up?" Karoline smiled warmly and replied, Messing up is part of the process. What matters isn't getting it perfect, it's showing up anyway. That conversation stayed with her long after she left campus. It reinforced something she already knew. Everyone has fears, doubts, and insecurities, but everyone also has the potential to rise above them. All it takes is one small act of bravery to set the wheels of change in motion. Years later, as Karoline stood on a stage addressing a packed auditorium, she paused mid-speech and looked out at the sea of faces before her. Some were young, wide-eyed, and eager to learn. Others were older, weathered by life's challenges yet still hopeful for a better tomorrow. And in that moment, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for where she was now, but for the winding road that had brought her there. She ended her speech with a simple yet powerful reminder. None of us are meant to walk this journey alone. We're here to lift each other up, to challenge each other to grow, and to remind each other that our voices matter. So whether you're standing in front of a crowd or sitting quietly in a corner, remember this. You have the power to spark change, simply by being brave enough to show up. The audience erupted into applause, but Karoline barely noticed. Her mind was already drifting to the next chapter of her story, whatever it might hold. She knew the work was far from over, but she also knew she wasn't alone. Together with countless others carrying the same torch, she was building a world where courage and compassion went hand in hand, a world where everyone had a seat at the table. As she stepped off the stage and into the bustling crowd waiting to greet her, Karoline felt a deep sense of peace. She had started as a shy college student unsure of her place in the world. Now she was a beacon of hope for so many. And though her journey was far from finished, she knew one thing for certain. Every step she took was worth it. Because in the EU, and it wasn't about leaving behind a legacy, it was about creating ripples of kindness, understanding, and courage that would continue long after she was gone. Years later, Karoline found herself sitting on a park bench one crisp autumn afternoon, the kind of day that reminded her of the very first time she had walked into that philosophy class. The air was cool, the leaves crunched underfoot, and the world seemed alive with possibility. As she sipped her coffee, she noticed a young woman approaching her. At first, she thought it might be another fan or someone wanting advice, but this encounter felt different. The woman sat down beside her hesitantly, clutching a worn copy of Courage Beyond Comfort. She looked nervous, glancing at Karoline before blurting out, "I just wanted to say thank you. Your story saved me when I didn't think anyone could." Karoline smiled warmly, inviting the woman to share more. And as the stranger began speaking, Karoline realized how much her own journey had unknowingly intertwined with so many others. This young woman had been struggling in college, feeling torn between staying true to her beliefs and fitting in with her peers who dismissed faith as outdated. Reading Karoline's book had given her permission to embrace both parts of herself, to stand firm in what she believed while remaining open to learning from others. "I never thought I'd see someone like me in a story," the woman admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "It made me realize I wasn't alone, and now I've started leading discussions at my church about how to talk to people who don't believe the same things we do. It's scary, but it feels right." Karoline listened intently, her heart swelling with gratitude. This was exactly why she had kept pushing forward, even during the hardest moments. Her words weren't just reaching ears, they were igniting action. Each person inspired by her story became a ripple in the pond, spreading kindness, understanding, and courage to those around them. As the years went on, these ripples grew into waves. Schools across the country adopted her book as part of their curriculum, using it to teach students about empathy, resilience, and respectful dialogue. Community centers held workshops based on her methods for fostering connection, helping people from all walks of life come together despite their differences. Even corporations began inviting her to speak to employees, recognizing that healthy communication and mutual respect were essential not just in classrooms or homes, but in workplaces too. But perhaps the most unexpected twist came when Karoline received an email from a filmmaker. He explained that he had been following her work for years and believed her story deserved to be told on a larger scale. "Your message is timeless," he wrote. "It's about finding common ground in a divided world, and we need that now more than ever. Before she knew it, plans were underway to turn her journey into a documentary. The process of making the film brought back memories Karoline hadn't thought about in years. Old friends and acquaintances reached out to share how her actions had impacted them. One former classmate confessed that watching her stand up to the professor had inspired him to pursue activism in his community. Another recalled how her calm demeanor during heated debates had taught her the value of listening over arguing, a lesson she carried into her career as a counselor. When the documentary premiered, it resonated deeply with audiences worldwide. People from all backgrounds connected with Karoline's vulnerability, authenticity, and determination. Messages poured in from viewers sharing their own stories of overcoming fear and standing up for what they believed in. Many said the film had given them hope at times when they felt hopeless, reminding them that even small acts of courage could create big changes. Through it all, Karoline remained humble. She often joked that she was just a regular person who got lucky, but deep down, she knew better. Luck hadn't brought her this far. Her willingness to face discomfort, take risks, and stay true to herself had. She also understood that none of this would have been possible without the support of others. Every mentor, friend, critic, and stranger played a role in shaping her journey, proving once again that no one succeeds alone. One of the most touching moments came when she visited a high school where her book had become required reading. Students greeted her with handmade signs and heartfelt letters thanking her for inspiring them to find their voices. During the Q&A session, a boy raised his hand and asked, "What if I'm scared to speak up because I don't know enough? What if I mess up?" Karoline leaned closer, meeting his gaze. "You don't have to know everything to make a difference," she said gently. "Sometimes it's not about having all the answers. It's about being brave enough to ask questions. And yes, you'll probably mess up along the way. So will I. But here's the thing, every step counts, even the missteps. They're proof that you're trying." Her response earned applause, but more importantly, it sparked something in the room, a shared understanding that growth isn't about perfection. It's about progress. It's about showing up even when it's hard and trusting that your efforts will matter. As Karoline continued traveling, speaking, and connecting with people, she began to notice a shift, not just in others but in herself. The shy, uncertain girl who had once trembled at the thought of raising her hand in class had transformed into a confident, compassionate advocate for change. Yet she still carried pieces of that younger self within her, the curiosity, the vulnerability, the hunger to learn and grow. Those qualities kept her grounded, reminding her that no matter how far she traveled, there was always more to discover. On quiet evenings, she often reflected on how her life had unfolded. There had been challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt, but there had also been triumphs, connections, and endless opportunities to make a difference. Looking back, she realized her greatest achievement wasn't any award or recognition she had received. It was the knowledge that she had stayed true to herself while uplifting others. And so, as she closed another chapter of her life, Karoline smiled, knowing the ripple effect she had started would continue long after she was gone. Her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had been touched by it, carried it forward, and added their own unique twist to its legacy. In a world that often felt divided, she had shown that courage and compassion could coexist, and that together they could move mountains. Because in the end, it wasn't about leaving behind a name or a title. It was about creating a chain reaction of kindness, understanding, and bravery. One person, one conversation, one moment at a time. And as long as that chain kept growing, Karoline knew her work was far from finished.